I'm an American. Do you want to shoot me too?
Yes. Yes.
Kim Jong-il was a paranoid psychopath, one of the most evil dictators of all time.
The North Korean regime remains one of the world's leading proliferator.
If we are to rid the world of this nefarious regime, we have to consider the options. In this video, I'll go over the 7 ways to take down North Korea.
It seems like whenever anyone in the West talks about the DPRK, their perception of the country is dominated by images of militarism.
Tanks, rockets, bayonets, and nuclear weapons.
But why is almost no one asking why? Why are the North Koreans such a militaristic people? Is it because they hate freedom? Are they controlled by some dictatorship that wants to destroy the free world?
Or is it because the country has been forced into a state of war for literally its entire existence? Is it because they've tried honest diplomacy and their confidence has been betrayed every single time? To answer these questions, we need to understand the history of the Korean people. It's a story of struggle and perseverance, oppression and liberation, periods of intense suffering and others of hard-won happiness. It's a story of a peace-loving people's unremitting battle to free itself from the chains of imperialism. And if the Korean people have learned anything from their epic historical saga, it's that freedom from imperialism and peace come only at the end of their bayonet. The year is 1935. Inside a log cabin hidden away atop the legendary Ep.2 mountain, North Korea's founding father-to-be, Kim Il-sung, gazes upon a huddled mass of miserable, emaciated people. Just outside, a few dozen mostly orphaned children. Most of their parents were brutally murdered. They may have starved to death in a wintertime blockade. Maybe they were killed in one of the many savage counterinsurgency campaigns. No one will ever know. These were the victims of Japanese imperialism in Manchuria and Korea, one of the most barbaric episodes the modern world has ever seen. The decades-long saga was filled with murderous campaigns against peasants. Those said to be communists or aiding them were slaughtered by the thousands. Entire villages were burned to the ground on the assumption that if you killed 100 Koreans, there was bound to be at least one communist among them. Many who managed to escape death were captured by police collaborators and sent to a secret biological lab called Unit 731. They were tortured, surgically experimented on without anesthesia, injected with toxins, and subjected to forced abortions. When the facility ran low on test subjects, whom they ominously called logs in official documentation, the administration regularly called the local prison to send more communists. For the Japanese occupiers, every Korean was a potential supporter of independence. Every Korean was a potential revolutionary. Every Korean was a potential communist. So when Kim Il-sung offered Koreans a chance at freedom to take up arms against the horrific Japanese occupation, for the wretched of the earth and the traumatized orphans huddled atop Mount Ep.2 that day, the choice was obvious. They joined the ranks of the impoverished farmers, squatters, and bandits who comprised Kim Il-sung's guerrilla force. Together they fought under Kim Il-sung's command, and together they won against the Japanese at the historic Battle of Pyongyang. After years of fierce fighting alongside their Chinese comrades in eastern Manchuria, their victory at Pyongyang became the moment the world understood that Japanese colonialism in Korea was not invincible. As Kim Il-sung later described the scene, the flames over the night sky of Pyongyang in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness. The Pyongyang battle was a historic battle which not only showed to the Korean people who thought Korea to be dead that Korea is not dead but alive, but also gave them the confidence that when they fight, they can achieve national independence and liberation. Inspired by their success, Kim Il-sung's guerrilla movement spread throughout the region, seizing property from landlords and Japanese collaborators, while giving it to the poor peasants who tilled it. They destroyed the remnants of feudalism by establishing equal rights for women in guerrilla-occupied areas. It should come as no surprise that these shenanigans put Kim Il-sung on Tokyo's most wanted list. There was even a special detachment of the Imperial Army entirely devoted to hunting the communist leader down. The occupiers employed every brutal method at their disposal to repress Korea's communist independence fighters, and throughout the Second World War the struggle continued. But by 1940, the communist guerrilla leader's fortune took a turn for the worse. Kim was the only leader of his army left alive, forcing him and his comrades to flee for their lives to the USSR, where they would serve in the 88th Separate Rifle Brigade of the Red Army. Until... between 129,000 and 226,000 people, mostly civilians, killed instantly. The US had cemented its place in the iron tomes of history as the first and so far only country to deploy a nuclear weapon. The devastating power of an atom divided, showcased at the unveiling of the common ancestor to today's nuclear harbingers of death, utterly and dialectically changed the political landscape of the entire planet. On the one hand, it put a swift end to the Japanese Empire, along with its brutal decades-long occupation of East Asia and the Pacific. The way was paved for Kim and his comrades in exile to finally liberate their people with the help of the Red Army. But they didn't stop there. In 1948, the wretched of the earth, the peasants, the outlaws, the orphans, those who had lost everything at the hands of Japanese imperialism, those who had loyally followed Kim Il-sung from the peak of Mount Ep.2 and made the arduous journey alongside him to a bittersweet, hard-won victory, founded the Democratic People's Republic of Korea north of the 38th parallel. The newborn socialist state, its Workers' Party, and its organizational principles were all based upon the guerrilla experience of Korea's anti-imperialist movement. Chu To-il was a vice-marshal of the country's armed forces and a former guerrilla. His mother and 3 brothers were all killed at the hands of the Japanese. Another guerrilla was Yi Oh-sung, whose father and 2 sisters starved to death fighting the occupation. He became the headmaster of the Mangyongdae Revolutionary School, which still trains the most revolutionary party members in statesmanship. Chu and Yi were 2 of many examples of revolutionary orphans who came to power after expelling the Japanese from Korea. And it was Kim Il-sung who personally adopted the DPRK's founding fathers and mothers. For those who haven't dug deep into Korean history and see the country only through the Western media, it's understandable why the reverence North Koreans have for the Kim family might seem strange. Hysterically crying at their leaders' funerals, portraits in their houses, plaques on benches that their leader sat on. But once one understands Kim Il-sung's colossal contributions to the liberation of the Korean people, this all begins to make sense. The DPRK was founded with the formerly oppressed Korean proletariat under the leadership of Kim Il-sung at its core. To North Koreans, he's the star whose rays forced the light of liberty onto a dark, oppressed peninsula, as the old revolutionary song Star of Korea goes. This is why North Koreans not only revere Kim Il-sung as their eternal president, but also as their father. It's no surprise either that this reverence has been passed down through generations. As one of the better Western scholars on the DPRK, Bruce Cummings, put it, loyalty and filial piety form the deepest wellsprings of Korean virtue, nurtured over thousands of years, just as myriad Korean tales of the rare powers, magnificent ethics, and bottomless omniscience of the long list of kings who presided over a millennium of dynasties formed the subjective basis of the Korean identity, and its love of exemplary leaders. But every dialectical thesis has its antithesis. Across the 38th parallel, a very different country formed simultaneously. It was a place where landlords, anti-communists, and most tragically foreign empires reigned supreme. A land to which Korean collaborators with Japanese imperialism fled. Its heroes were very different from those in the north. There was the army's chief of staff, Paik San-yup, a former officer in the Manchukuo Imperial Army during occupation, and member of the Gando Special Force, a collaborator unit that hunted down Koreans fighting for independence. Park Hung-sik was widely known as one of the most notorious industrialist collaborators. His vision for Korea's future saw the country both as a source of raw materials and purchaser of manufactured products from Japan. A typical imperialist economic scheme in which his company, an agent of Ford Motors, would have profited to the detriment of his own people. Just live and let live when it comes to Japan, as he once said. Park Chung-hee, who became president in the South in 1962 through a military coup, was even part of the Japanese military detachment created exclusively to kill Kim Il-sung. More shocking, though, was the guiding political ideology developed by South Korea's founding president, Syngman Rhee, called Ilmanism. It combined extreme anti-communist nationalism and ethnic supremacy in a way that resembled the guiding principles of imperialist Japan, which has led many scholars to draw parallels between Ilmanism and Nazism.
As opposed to the Iron Curtain that divided Europe, Korea was divided by a line more akin to a thread. The North was communist, anti-imperialist, and supported by the world's first dictatorship of the proletariat, the USSR. The South was capitalist, willing to collaborate with foreign powers, and supported by the only country in the world willing to use nuclear weapons against civilian populations, and that was the United States.
Contrary to popular belief, it was actually South Korea that instigated the Korean War. Insurrections against the government in Seoul began propping up across the South as early as 1948, when the Jeju Island Uprising took place, in which thousands of pro-North activists and guerrillas who came to support them were massacred. They were 1/5 of the island's population. The bloodshed on Jeju Island was so brutal that it gave birth to the Yosu Suncheon Rebellion several months later. Thousands of South Koreans took up arms against Syngman Rhee's collaborationist government and were consequently slaughtered by the military, along with even more civilians accused of aiding them.
Seoul likely realized it couldn't rely on popular support with the DPRK right on its doorstep, and so the South began attacking North Korean villages and violating the agreed-upon border as early as June 1949. It wasn't long after that the DPRK and USSR had realized that the South was preparing to invade with the help of the United States.
So the DPRK's Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel in June of 1950 to liberate the southern half of its motherland, still under the de facto control of foreign powers and their collaborators. Within days, Southern forces were in full retreat, abandoning their equipment and defecting to the liberating Northern forces en masse. Victory was on the horizon for the sons and daughters of Mount Paektu. But at that very moment, with the backing of a United Nations composed of Western imperialist powers and their client states, the bloodthirsty war machine that reduced the empire of the rising sun to atomic ash returned to the Far East for another campaign of slaughter. The titular leader of the North Korean puppet regime and ostensible commander of the North Korean armies is Kim Il-sung, a 38-year-old giant from South Korea where he is wanted as a fugitive from justice. We are facing an army of barbarians in Korea. They are barbarians as trained, as relentless, as reckless of life, and as skilled in the tactics of the kind of war they fight as the hordes of Genghis Khan. Mongolians, Soviet Asiatics, and a variety of races, among the most primitive of peoples. Individual lives are not valued so highly in Eastern Moors. It is totally unrealistic of us to expect the individual Korean soldier to follow our most elevated precepts of warfare. The Oriental dies stoically because he thinks of death as the beginning of life. Koreans have an arrested mental development. As if he were the incarnation of death itself, Commander-in-Chief of UN forces Douglas MacArthur landed on the Korean peninsula, bringing destruction in his wake. The skies of Korea turned black from the hundreds of thousands of barrels of US napalm dropped indiscriminately upon civilians and combatants of both sides alike. Men all around me were burned. They lay rolling in the snow. Men I knew, marched and fought with, begged me to shoot them. It was terrible. Where the napalm had burned the skin to a crisp, it would be peeled back from the face, arms, legs, like fried potato chips. The slayer needs merely touch a button, and death is on the wing, blindly blotting out the remote, the unknown people, holocausts of death, veritable mass productions of death, spreading an abysmal desolation over whole communities. Littered with the bones and burnt flesh of over 1.5 million civilians from the north, the earth became unrecognizable. The fields were poisoned with anthrax and cholera, something the US denies, but reports from the International Scientific Commission appear to document. Massacres so numerous at the hands of the Seoul government and US forces that they would not all fit in this video even if we tried to include them. They littered the country with mass graves marking extrajudicial executions. For every person living in Pyongyang, 2 bombs were dropped on the city, leaving around 75% of its infrastructure a smoldering ruin. The major industrial cities of Hamhung, Hungnam, Sariwon, Sinanju, and the port of Chinampo all suffered over 80% destruction. The North's industrial, agricultural, and energy production capacities were for all intents and purposes entirely destroyed. And as U.S. Air Force General Curtis LeMay casually noted, we killed off 20% of the population.
But for MacArthur, his officers, and his South Korean puppets, that was not enough. If the DPRK's unconditional surrender came at the price of its people's complete annihilation, that was a price they were willing to pay.
Newly communist China saw the threat posed by the world's most dangerous imperialist war machine being on its doorstep, and it intervened on behalf of the North in October of 1950, eventually bringing the war to a stalemate. MacArthur called forth the ultimate weapons of death for a plan to win the war in 10 days. I would have dropped between 30 and 50 atomic bombs strung across the neck of Manchuria, spread behind us from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea, a belt of radioactive cobalt. It has an active life of between 60 and 120 years. For at least 60 years, there could have been no land invasion of Korea from the north. My plan was a cinch. Although he didn't get as many nukes as he had hoped for, 9 Mark IV nuclear bombs were deployed to Guam and put on standby to be dropped by B-52s in Korea. U.S. President Harry Truman ordered them to be used against the Chinese and North Koreans. He wrote, signed, and stamped the order, and then MacArthur was relinquished of duty before it was sent. The commander-in-chief of UN and South Korean forces had become increasingly insubordinate with President Truman. It already became clear that General MacArthur had become a loose cannon, that he may have unilaterally launched nuclear weapons at China, risking another world war. With MacArthur out of the picture, Truman changing his mind about using nukes, and an inescapable stalemate, both sides signed an armistice in July 1953.
However, Seoul refused to sign, and to this day the war technically continues, with the South Korean military under the command of Washington. And since then, they've done everything in their power to threaten the DPRK into submission.
In 1958, in violation of the terms of the armistice, the U.S. placed nuclear-tipped missiles with a range of over 1,000 kilometers in South Korea, aimed at the USSR, China, and the DPRK. Nuclear demolition mines were later installed across the DMZ, each with the explosive force of the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Equally as provocative were the annual US-led Team Spirit joint military exercises, which simulated invading the North under the cover of tactical nuclear strikes.
In a very peaceful manner of retaliation, the DPRK became a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Pact in 1985. On the one hand, it prevented Pyongyang from developing nuclear weapons, but on the other, it was supposed to shield the DPRK from threats by nuclear-armed powers like the United States. The threats did not cease. In fact, they intensified.
After agreeing to suspend Team Spirit in 1992, a year later they resumed them. U.S. Strategic Command then retargeted nuclear missiles previously aimed at the USSR at the DPRK. With the collapse of the USSR in 1991, North Korea lost its strongest ally and most important trade partner. All of the sudden, they found themselves with even more crosshairs trained on them. At this point, Pyongyang had had enough, and declared it was pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was once again met by threats from former US President Bill Clinton, who said if North Korea got a nuclear weapon, it would mean the end of the country as we know it. That move was enough to scare Washington into offering high-level talks, though, so North Korea accepted their invitation and suspended its withdrawal. Throughout these talks in 1993, the mainstream media constantly broadcasted hysterical stories accusing the DPRK of trying to nuke the US, when it was literally the North trying to protect itself from nuclear threats coming from the world's strongest nuclear empire.
The DPRK's demands were very simple. You don't like the graphite nuclear reactors we use that can produce materials for nuclear weapons? Well, give us light water reactors that can't produce those materials. Give us a promise that you won't attack us or nuke us. Stop the military exercises on our border and normalize relations with us.
The US agreed. In return, Pyongyang was to shut down its graphite reactors and resume inspections mandated under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's what they did. On the other hand, Washington did nothing to fulfill its obligations. The threats continued, the simulations of nuclear strikes against the North continued, and the light water reactors were never delivered. After 5 years of inaction by the United States, the DPRK declared that its nuclear program would resume, if the US did not get its act together. Still, Washington was able to string them along without fulfilling any of its obligations and calling them part of an axis of evil until 2003. That's when Pyongyang finally and definitively dedicated itself to developing nuclear weapons for deterrence.
And that's been the country's policy to this day. It's a policy that understands that the only language spoken by a ferocious, violent, bloodthirsty empire with little to no regard for human life is the threat of violence.
Developing nuclear weapons helped the North Korean economy as well, which was seriously suffering after the collapse of the USSR. It freed up huge amounts of money previously invested in the military, under a more costly conventional deterrence policy called Songun, or military first. Even after everything that's happened, though, the 2018-2019 talks between the Trump administration and Pyongyang showed that the DPRK still wants to pursue long-standing peace without nuclear weapons, if it has a guarantee that it won't be attacked by Washington. Pyongyang dismantled nuclear test sites under international supervision. It suspended anti-US propaganda and missile tests, as per their agreement.
And the US refused to lift a single sanction until North Korea was completely denuclearized. On top of that, the provocations continued.
We have very much in mind the Libya model from 2003, 2004.
I mean, imagine if you were in North Korea's shoes right now. You'd have to be an idiot to give up your nuclear weapons. They'd be your only guarantee that you won't be steamrolled by the US war machine, which kills whoever it wants and is never seriously penalized because even its allies are afraid of it. We've seen this equation time and time again.
Demand disarmament from a country that could possibly put up a fight. Lie, call them murderers, dictators, human rights abusers, killers, and invade them if they don't do what they're told. If they comply, lie, call them murderers, dictators, human rights abusers, killers, and invade them anyway. But the threat of even a minor nuclear retaliation makes geopolitical banditry on this scale too much of a risk.
That's why we need to seriously think about who is the real threat here.
An empire that once killed millions of Koreans, reduced the country to an ash pit, put former Japanese collaborators in power, showcased just how powerful its weapons are in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, constantly threatens the peninsula with nuclear annihilation, and currently has nuclear weapons around the world as well as 30,000 troops on the border to follow through with its threats?
Or a country that has been fighting a defensive war against various empires throughout its entire existence and has a handful of nuclear weapons.
On behalf of the channel's production team, thank you so much to rank-and-file revolutionary Alexander Kuzmienko, Commissar Anthea Napper, and General Secretary Jessica Fang. Your contributions are invaluable to the continuation of our work. We love you very much. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked the video and you want to see more content about the DPRK, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll know about new videos as soon as they come out. Also, make sure to check out our Instagram account. The link's in the description. Workers of the world, unite!